Today we're going to be talking to Kyle about an introduction to Vite and building our own like server-side rendering framework similar to NextJS. He's got a lot of experience with NextJS and he's even done talks at NextConf. So I'd love to hear his thoughts on my process and everything.
Cool. It's happy to be here.
Sweet. So if you want to give any a little introduction about yourself before we get started, that'd be good.
Yeah, my name's Kyle. I've been doing like web dev stuff for a little over 5 years now. I went to University of Oregon, but never finished my degree, one class away. So I think it'll probably stay that way for a long time. For a paycheck, I've worked at Leica, the University of Oregon, a startup called Autogravity, Nike, Acorns, and now the startup I'm at currently called Air. And then even if it's not for a paycheck, I do a lot of coding for fun on the side. I've done a few contributions to a lot of open source projects, and I also work with a nonprofit called Operation Code. And if I'm not coding, then I'm probably losing at Rocket League or watching Arsenal lose.
Nice. Well, with that being said, let's get into this post a little bit. Have you ever used Vite by chance?
If not, I know all about it though. Very excited for it.
Okay. You mentioned before we started the podcast SWC, which I haven't used. Have you played with that at all? Do you know much about like the differences between that?
So I'm watching like the non-JavaScript bundler space very intently, but I haven't used any of them. There's a person that used to work for Stripe that's also using a programming language called Zaglang, and he's trying to make a bundler, and he's showing numbers like 100 times faster than ESBuild even. So just the space that people are in, I think once everybody acknowledged like it's okay to not use JavaScript, ES builds with Go. I think SWC uses Rust, and then this other person's compiler that's not done is using Zag. So everybody's just using languages that aren't JavaScript and leveraging it in a way that lets people compile, transfile, and bundle just way faster. And I'm super excited for it all.
I don't know. That's going to be really crazy if something is that much faster than even ESBuild, because
Oh, yeah.
switching this major project that I've already used to it is like insane. I don't know how you could get much faster.
Yeah, I mean, but think to yourself like how you thought it could get much faster, back in the day too. I remember when I first started, it was like gulp scripts and grunt scripts. So things have
Yeah.
changed.
So before we get too far into this post, let's talk a little bit about Vite itself. So not only is it super fast and uses ESBuild under the hood, but lately in the most recent version, they released legacy browser support. And the way they're doing it, I think, is really smart. And it should have been the way things have been done for years. It will auto generate a legacy bundle for you, as you can see down here, and it will only load that in those legacy browsers. Whereas right now, even on this really big app I have at work, we have all these polyfills for IE11 that are just included. And even if you're in modern Chrome, you download all this extra. So I'm excited to see this and hopefully start using it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I wonder how, for example, like Next also has a bunch of native polyfills that you don't have to add, and I wonder how they load them.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how Next does it, but I think if they're just using the Babel preset EMV, I want to say it's just all in one bundle. Yeah,
We'll have to- We could want to look into it someday.
sweet. So let's see. I guess we can start talking through the actual blog post now.
Sure.
So this will just give you a little approach here as like what I was going for. So in Next.js, you can do get server side props and you can load stuff from the server and it gets injected into your component. So would you say, Kyle, this is pretty Next-like in this example here?
Absolutely.
Cool. And then I wanted to take it a little step further. And instead of having like Next has API routes, I wanted to just get my data right here in line. It's practical for these basic examples, but for more advanced things, you would need like query parameters and those sorts of things that you get with a regular API route. So to get started, some of the things we're going to be talking about is server-side rendering, which we already mentioned a couple times. I guess, Kyle, you actually got me into Next.js originally, and you were huge about server-side rendering. So I don't know if you want to give a quick little recap as to what it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, the recap would just be that, before the lands of React or even just a lot of JavaScript usage, the fact existed that you need to get data-driven content to a user on the browser. And it used to be, and still for a lot of people is today, that you get it by making a request to a server and their server returns to you HTML. So that would be literally server-side rendering, because the idea is your server does the work and spits out the document as a downloadable response. And yeah, when I talked about it with you, I think my favorite thing for Next.js is specifically that you don't get pigeonholed into one or the other. You get to choose on a per page basis, how you want to render things, which kind of always was the common problem with like React apps when I worked at companies. At some point, something would get popular enough, and you'd get a SEO person or somebody would just know off the top of their head, like, "Hey, we're not statically pre-rendering, some of our marketing content, and that's dinging us on our marketing." And so, right then and there, right, that's kind of where one super simple example of where like Next and server-side rendering helps you. You're able to choose these few pages to statically pre-render and not worry about necessarily others that might not provide SEO benefit.
Yeah, it's true. So let's get into the actual code base here. So to get started making this, we're going to go through step by step on a commit basis. And if you want to learn the full process for how I went through this, you can actually read the blog post. So to get started, I had an index.html, which is really common in really any React app. But with Vite specifically, you want to have a little HTML tag here to replace it with your app HTML that gets server rendered. And then you need to have like your entry point that gets loaded on the client. And then down below, you can see all the packages used for this project. I tried to use as few as possible. So there's Prisma, there's the React Refresh plugin, which handles hot reloading as you edit stuff, which is really awesome. And I found it much better than Webpack's different tool set that is there for React. Other than that, it's using React, using Express to actually do the server stuff. And then it has TS node just to make file changes quick and they get brought in quickly. And then Vite itself in TypeScript. So not too much here. And the last file being the Vite config that tells it you want to use React Refresh. And I inject the JSX import for React in here as well. Uh, any questions so far, Kyle, or is this all pretty simple?
Yeah, no questions at all.
Cool. So let's go back to the commits here and let's go to the server-side rendering step. So before we go over it, I'm going to check it out. So I'm going to come over here into my terminal, checking it out, starting it. So this way we can actually run it as we talk about it. So for right now, I'm making an entry point into the app. It gets this page prop, and that page prop is just an object with a component and whatever props you might pass to it. So if we go back to the post, that would be, in this case, I'm passing a name from get server side props. That will get passed into the component when it renders in the code you just saw. So then down here, we have this page loader, which I don't want to get too in depth into, but Vite has a few things that it exposes to you to do server-side rendering, such as like transforming the index.html. And you'll see these comments were brought from the Vite docs. And essentially, it transforms your HTML. It will inject the React refresh stuff, so you don't have to worry about it as you're editing components to just live update on the page. And you just had to call this one method. So it's really powerful what is done for you with just a few lines of code. And then down here, we're loading our entry point and we're loading our actual page to call the get server side props method and inject that into our component. So down here, this is actually the function that gets called every time you load a page. It calls our page loader, which was just above that we just talked about, and then it renders that React component to a string. And then it comes down here and replaces that app HTML comment from our last commit with the app's HTML. And it also injects the props that we mentioned before from the get server side props into the page for client side mounting. That's pretty much everything we needed to do. Vite also has this cool SSR stack trace thing, which will let you know where you have problems in your code without you having to like deduce it and figure it out from the render to string call, which I found really helpful. Other than that, this is the next part, which I would love to talk to Kyle about a little bit, or he can make more clear for everyone. This just takes like a URL and then gets a file path. So if I go to /test, which let's go right here. Right now I load it up, /test, it then converts it to like, hey, in the pages folder, it's /test.tsx. And Kyle can speak to this a little bit about how in Next.js, there's like a lot more powerful functionality than that. In this little example right now, you just have a regular path name and it goes to a component. But yeah, Kyle, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the other things you can do with the URL and mapping those to files in Next.
Yeah, I mean, framework specific. I'm sure you could get the same feature set. You can, with Next, a file name may have square brackets around it, which might make it an optional square bracket with triple dots in front of the variable name in the file name.
Hmm.
So if you might go to the code for me that you were just at, yeah, exactly. So that would be what's called an optional catch-all route. It basically will catch. So in this example, you have it at pages. So whatever route you don't have covered, so in this example, you have index and test covered, every other request to your website will go through this optional catch-all route. Um, it gets a little more complicated or nuanced, for example, if you do an optional catch-all within a folder, because then, for example, the optional catch-all helps you get the index as well as other requests to that page. Um, and then another possibility might be, instead of doing triple dots, you can just have a variable within square brackets, which would basically be a parameterized URL. And that's kind of going back to where optional catch-all helps out, is because you can have a parameterized URL and also an optional for the case. Like, for example, with blog, right? You might have slash blog, which is the listing of all your blogs. So you can choose to express that as pages slash blog.tsx or pages slash blog as a folder that has an index file and a parameterized file. Or you can just do the blog folder with an optional catch-all, and that will be the file for all of your blog requests, and you can split from there.
Hmm. And all of these things are possible to make, but I just like pointing out as we go. And Kyle, feel free to jump in. Like just how much work it is to really make like a full framework. This is like just to get your like ideas flowing and just to see, oh wow, all of this stuff is like happening when you don't even have to
Yeah.
think about it when you use something else. So
And I just want to make a statement. I realized I made a mistake of in calling it optional. Those are just catch-alls. Optional catch-all is when you have two pairs of square brackets around the variable. And then, yeah, it's not just down to the parameterized routing, but something that's interesting in your code that's actually like an optional aspect of the config in Next. Some people like trailing slashes. So you'd have
mhm.
to plan for that too, which is kind
Yeah,
of
that
funny.
that too. And yeah, it's super basic right now. So uh, at this step, like we have server side rendering, so I can load the test page and I can load the home page, and it works. It's just the same as if you just had static HTML files. You'll notice that right here we have a console log like hello, and if I inspect the page and I try to click, there's nothing happening because all we're doing is server side rendering. So everything you saw right here was just to get it to where you load a path, it grabs that file and its server renders it, and that's it. There's no client side interaction yet. So now with that, let's look at the next commit, which is a very small one. I was just adding, and then we can just check it out here to see it. All I did was add a get server side props that injects a message. And so if we run that again, come back over here, it says hello from server. Before it was just right here. Now you can actually see this is from the server, which isn't that intuitive yet because we're not doing anything special here that requires server-side logic. So with that, let's keep going. This is the next big part, which is trying to do client-side routing. And this could be a little confusing, especially as we go through this. So the first thing is, and actually, Kyle, I'm curious if you know how this works exactly in Next.js, because I don't, I haven't looked into it. In my example, I have this routes array, and this would be like auto generated by the framework. So anytime you add a new file into the pages folder, it would like automatically inject into this file another route component, like another route object in here with the path and a dynamic import statement. I know that, yeah, actually, I guess I'm just going to leave that off to you. Do you know how Next does this, like actually?
No, I haven't looked into it.
Cool.
Maybe something we can look at as the source
So
code.
I wrote this like three different times, three different ways before I wrote this post. One of the things that I didn't want to do in the beginning, I just server rendered like slash test and returned it. And then like server rendered the home page and returned it, which is great. It's just loading that one component and nothing else. But the problem is if you have like two different pages and you want to client side route between them, which is really powerful, right? Like we all know that if you just like click a link to the about page and it's instant, you don't have a full server load, like that's really nice. But how do you do that without including all of that extra stuff in your code? Maybe you have like a whole bunch of orders, an about page, a blog, all of these things. You don't want all of those components in the bundle on every page. You just want what's actually needed for that one page. So the way I came up with this was having this little routes array. So if you click on the home link and you're on the test page, it can call the dynamic import statement. So it will load this code at the point in time when someone clicks it, and then it actually updates the page to display that component.
Yeah, it might be something similar. And the reason I guess that is because of the fact that they do prefetching. And there's tons of reasons why you'd want to do prefetching besides a dynamic import. But the fact that it's default behavior implies to me that, it's done in a similar way that where there's a dynamic import that occurs on the request.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk about prefetching, I talk about there's both a manual function called prefetch that you can pass a path from their use router hook, or you can just use the link component and you'll automatically prefetch the href of a link when it slides into the viewport.
So
Both of those
speaking of
things, I
that,
believe, dynamically import the pages.
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but speaking of
Oh, you're
that, it
fine.
made me want to jump ahead a little bit. So I made a link component, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but it calls this navigate method that the library exposes. It'd be very easy to make this custom hook expose a prefetch method. So instead of navigating, maybe when you hover, so you could add like an on mouse over to this A tag and you could prefetch it, similar to what Kyle's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so back to where we were at. So I have this routes thing, and you can just imagine the moment, and this doesn't happen in the framework yet either. This is just another thing you would have to do if you wanted to build something full, like a full on framework. So let's say the moment I add like order, it's hard for me to type over this mic, uh, order.tsx. You could imagine if I had the server running, which I do, the moment that that happens, this array gets automatically updated. It sees that a new page is in the pages folder and it adds it here, just these two lines. And so then what I did next was I made a context in React, and this context just stores the active page. So if you're on /test, it's currently /test and the component there. So it's this object. And then a function to set the active page. And that will be used when you client side link between stuff. So then let's look at our actual hook down here. It's called use move it, and it just returns a navigate method. And it might look a little complicated if you've never seen this before, but what it's doing is quite simple. It's doing a promise.all for two things. In order to navigate to some page, we need its data and we need the component. So we loop over the routes, which are right above here, and we find one where the path matches whatever path they're trying to go to. So if we're trying to go to /test, it finds the one right here and grabs its component. And then it also calls get server data, which is this little function I made right here. It hits an endpoint on our Express server and it just gives it like, hey, here's the path to the component. Call get server side props from that file and return us the JSON. So once those two things are done, then it sets the active page. So this is yet another spot where I'd love to hear Kyle's thoughts, because this could be done a lot of different ways, even just those few things I mentioned. Maybe get the server data takes too long, or maybe you want to immediately load the page before the server data, but then you would have a loading spinner. There's just so many different things to really decide on right here. Like, what do you think, Kyle? You're muted. Yeah. So I asked what you were
Um,
thinking about this type of stuff. Any comments?
Yeah, so that's why it really depends on that's why what makes it so great is being able to decide on a per page basis, because what I would say is like you want to do it this way if you have a get static props method, because you're telling your framework, I need you to go get data from the server in order for you to render this page. There's other things that you can do in Next which you could build into to move it. There's the implicit um, statically pre-rendering of pages that don't have any data fetching methods. So you could integrate into your framework the idea that if there's no data fetching methods like get server side props from the framework, it's going to try to pre-build it anyways for you automatically. So I think in all cases, you would call get server side props if that method existed. And then at the very least, you're still going to be calling that Vite transform method, regardless of what the page file is.
Cool. So to continue now, then we set the active page, and then we call history.pushState, which is just the built-in browser API. And this is another little gotcha. Some browsers do things differently with the history API. React Router, the team behind it, they actually made their own little history abstraction, which anyone could use just to smooth out some of those inconsistencies. So that's yet another thing that you kind of have to be aware of. And one thing we haven't even talked about yet is error handling. There's no error handling here at all. Like, what happens if for some reason that page can't be loaded, or the server data response fails and has like an error? We aren't really handling those, and we don't offer any way for the user to handle them. So many things to think about. Now, when we go back into our entry, before it was just rendering create element with whatever page. Now we just have a context around it because we want to let the user possibly change the page from anywhere in the React tree. So context is the best way. You can call navigate from anywhere and it will always work. So that's the point of that. And then we added our hydrate method. So this makes it so we can actually click stuff on the front end. And I'll check this commit out in a second and show you. But when the page loads on the client side, it checks, okay, in that routes array, where's the active route? And then it waits for that component to be loaded. And once that component is loaded dynamically, then we can hydrate React. Again, to keep the bundle really simple, this bundle just has this little bit of code and a reference to all the pages. Every time the page loads, it checks, okay, what component do we need to load, loads it with another network request, and then hydrates React. Then there's just a few TypeScript types here, and then updating the page to like have a link. So let's pull this commit down and take a look. And so this is actually what I expected. I didn't actually have the link here yet. So the next commit is the actual one we should go over and check out. So the link component is in this commit, and all it does is pull in our context method called navigate, and it prevents the default when you do an anchor tag click. And what's cool about this is that if you don't have JavaScript enabled, you still see the HTML. You click it, it does a full server page load, and it works just fine. Obviously, your JS interactions won't work, but links and everything still work, which is another key point to why people are so big on server-side rendering. It's just less opportunity for things to be broken. And then down here, this was the other thing. We reference that data endpoint that actually gets server-side props whenever they navigate between pages. This is all it is. It uses the same method we used earlier to get the page, and we're just sending back the props. Also, we just have to replace data in front of the URL since we're passing data / whatever path. We just want to remove data and call the page loader like normal. So then down here, I registered that data route, and then over here, use the link. So let's pull down this commit and take a look. Hopefully this one works. All right, so now we have hello from server, and if I click it, hello actually gets logged. Now we're hydrating everything. And then let's take a look. If we clicked go to test, it works. I could refresh it, it works. I click go home, it works, and it pulled in the stuff from the server. And then what happens if I click the back button? So it went back because the browser told it to, but we didn't actually write the code for this. This was another thing I left out of the article. So I'm curious, Kyle, do you know how we would implement this? I just learned because I've never really worked with the history APIs, like an hour before this call, and I'm going to try to live code a little bit that is needed.
I mean, I'm guessing there's. I mean, if it still would all be client side navigation, so you'd want to use one of the history methods. I don't know if I'm only aware of the abstraction that React Router provides, so you could use like go -1 or back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so part of the problem with this is that like it's a method that I hadn't used before because we have to actually listen for the browser click. And so what that is, it's actually really easy. You have to use on pop state. And so let's take a look here. The first thing we need to do is we need to pull out this navigate method because we need it to be called when the browser back button is clicked. So I'm going to move this over here and I'm going to make another function here. I'm going to export it and just like that. And then I'm also going to tell it that set active page is now passed into it. So set active page, all it does is it just takes a page and it needs to return void. And so that should all work just the same, except this needs to have the two. Okay, that's actually really cool. So I've been using GitHub Copilot and I haven't gotten to use it too much yet. And I'm pretty happy with what it just suggested. That was cool. Kyle, I'm curious, have you used GitHub Copilot much yet?
I have access, but we've been given the thumbs down at work, so I haven't quite given it a good go. We're allowed to use it on our one open source repo, but I haven't been in there lately. So
Gotcha. So all I did was abstract this out and just made it take these two things. So what that lets us do is we come over here, and I'm going to do this, I guess, the correct way. I'm going to put a use effect, and then inside of the use effect, I'm going to say window dot on pop state. And whenever it pops, I'm going to call navigate. That was close to the window location path name. And let me import navigate. It should pop up. And then I also have to give it set active page. And I only noticed that thanks to TypeScript. And so then this doesn't need to change. We just want this effect to run when the page first loads. And all we're doing is registering this callback. And so this is another thing. It might not be correct to do this. You might need to like add an event listener because this might overwrite something else on the page that's using this. I don't know why anything else would be, but for the purpose of this tutorial, it works fine. So let's go back and see if it works. Hopefully it does, because it'd be very embarrassing if it didn't. Hit the back button and it went back. So exactly what I expected to happen. So we'll just do that again. I go to the test page, hit the browser back button, and let's clear the network tab so we can see what happens here. Go home, and it's calling the data for the home route before it goes to it, and it's getting hello from server. It already has the home component, so it's not making another request for that, and then it sets it active. Let's see. Now with that being said, we're getting close to being done. The next part that I added was Prisma, and so Kyle, have you used Prisma at all by chance?
No, but also very aware of it and like Asura, for example. Would love to get a chance one day.
Cool. Yeah, it's really awesome. I use it on a few different projects now, and I just thought it was a really great addition to this type of tutorial. It was a lot of stuff we've covered, but Prisma is really simple to throw in there. And so let's kind of go over that commit. So whenever you add Prisma and you run Prisma init, it throws in an env file with a database URL. Obviously, I'm committing my env file just for the purpose of this tutorial, and it's just using dummy credentials for Docker. But you never want to commit env files otherwise. Then all I had to do was import the Prisma client in my page loader, initialize Prisma, and then pass that in to get server-side props. So now just by doing that little bit of code, check back out stuff. Oh, okay, never mind. It switched. Come back over to the index. Prisma is now available in all of my get server-side props on every page that I would make. And then next, let's see. So then the next thing to talk about is Prisma has this schema file, which lets you define your database stuff. And now recently it works with Mongo. So if you want to use something NoSQL, you don't have to use Postgres or MySQL anymore with Prisma. So that's just something cool to mention. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I added a message model, which stores a bunch of messages. And I just store an ID that auto increments and some text. And then I also added a little seeder just to throw in welcome from Prisma to the homepage. Updated my homepage to actually call Prisma. So let's take a look at when we run npm start again and see it say hello from Prisma, and then we'll do a little bit more with Prisma before we finish. So it says welcome from Prisma. And now another really useful thing that you can do with Prisma is sometimes you are testing stuff and some data is like set a certain way and you don't know why, or you want to change a row, but you don't want to like actually add that API route because maybe you haven't gotten to it yet. Prisma has this really awesome GUI tool called Prisma Studio. And I found it to be really useful because in the past I'd use something like SQL Pro. It opened up on the wrong page. I've used something like SQL Pro. There's like a bunch of different ones like dbeaver, all of these different things, but some of them don't work with the database you're using. So maybe you're using Postgres, you need one client, another one, you need a different client. Prisma kind of takes care of it all for you with this nice little web-based editor. For simple things, it's really nice. You can't do complicated stuff in here that I know of, really crazy queries. But it gets the job done. So if I want to add a new record here, like let's say welcome from podcast, and I save it, we can go here, but I'm not running the server anymore. Load it back up, and it still says welcome from Prisma. So that's because by default, when we say find first, right here, it's finding it from the beginning. So Prisma's type safe client is super awesome. So you'll see we get all of this auto completion help. So order by, we want to order by the ID, and we want to say where it's descending. So if we save that, come back over here. Now it says welcome from podcast. So we're loading our latest messages from the database. And going to the studio, we're able to just inspect all of our messages really quickly. So it's pretty powerful. I love all of the stuff Prisma is doing. Every release there's something cool. Just to point out again, one of my favorite parts about it is the type safety. So if I want to say like, if I want to order by name descending, well, there is no name. And this might seem obvious right now, but maybe you're changing your data layer and you're adding a new field or removing one. You can immediately know in all of your code, like, oh, that little spot right there no longer works, and it won't even compile. So it's super helpful. Uh, so Kyle, any questions, thoughts about what I've gone over?
No questions. It's yeah. I mean, it's a great intro into what it's like to begin thinking about like an SSR framework. As you mentioned, like there's just so much ground to cover. I mean, yeah. Even on that last bit, you mentioned when you were just as an example of something else that we could do to add to the feature set. You mentioned that, for example, the home component was already dynamically imported, so it didn't need to load again once you navigated back and forward in the history state. In the same vein, if you set up like automatic static regeneration, static pre-rendering, you know, that could be a static document that doesn't actually rely on data fetching. So the whole document is cached for when you go back. It doesn't have to re-download.
That's a good point. Yet another awesome thing. And same thing with all the stale wall revalidate stuff that's becoming so popular and everything. That would be good to add. Cool. Well, with that being said, I want to thank you for being on here and going over it with me. Appreciate your time.
No problem. Great work.